Hello everyone, I am the Scary Midnight Dreams and I am here to help you to sleep today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where are you from and what time is in your country right now. The Black River. The mist hung low over the marshlands, a ghostly shroud that muffled sound and obscured sight. Jeremiah Crow, a fisherman by trade, had ventured farther into the wilderness than ever before. His usual fishing spots had grown barren, and desperation had driven him to explore the uncharted reaches of the swamp. As he pushed his small rowboat through the tangled reeds, he felt the air grow colder. The water beneath him darkened, turning from a murky brown to an inky black that seemed to drink in the light. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but the promise of untapped waters filled with fish silenced his fears. Then he saw it. The river. It snaked through the marsh like a living thing, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting nothing but the void of the overcast sky. Jeremiah's breath caught in his throat. He had heard tales of a black river whispered in hushed tones by the old men in town, but he had dismissed them as drunken ramblings. Stay away from the Black River, they had said. It takes more than it gives. But Jeremiah was not a superstitious man. He dipped his oar into the water and felt a strange resistance, as though the river itself were alive and aware of his presence. He shook off the unease and cast his line. The first wish came unintentionally. As Jeremiah waited for a bite, he muttered under his breath, "If only I could catch something worth selling." The line tugged violently, nearly pulling the rod from his hands. He struggled against the weight, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. When he finally reeled it in, he found a fish unlike any he had ever seen. Its scales shimmered with an iridescent glow, and its eyes gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. He brought the fish to market the next day, and it fetched a price that left him speechless. The buyer, a wealthy merchant, marveled at its beauty and paid him more than enough to cover his debts. Jeremiah returned to the Black River the following night. The second wish was deliberate. Sitting in his boat, the black water lapping softly against the hull, he spoke aloud. "I wish for a better life, a house, money, comfort." The river responded immediately. The water rippled, and a strange wind swept through the marsh. When Jeremiah returned home, he found his small, dilapidated shack replaced by a sturdy, well-furnished house. A chest of gold coins sat on the table, glinting in the candlelight. For weeks, Jeremiah lived like a king. He bought fine clothes, feasted on rich foods, and reveled in his newfound fortune. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His reflection in the mirror seemed dimmer, his eyes duller. He felt tired, even after long nights of rest. The third wish was made in desperation. Jeremiah's health began to decline. His skin grew pale, his hands trembled, and a persistent cold settled in his bones. He returned to the Black River, his heart heavy with dread. "I wish to be whole again," he said, his voice shaking. The river's response was immediate and violent. The water churned, and a figure rose from its depths, a dark, featureless silhouette with eyes like burning coals. It stared at him, and he felt its gaze pierce through his soul. "The price is steep," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "What price?" Jeremiah asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your soul," the figure replied. "Piece by piece, it has been claimed with each wish. There is little left of you now." Jeremiah's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to flee the cursed river and never return, but he was rooted in place. "What can I do?" he whispered. The figure tilted its head. "There is no undoing what has been done, but you may choose. One final wish, or the last fragment of your soul." Jeremiah returned home. the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, comfort, success. But it felt hollow. He was a shell of the man he once was, his laughter forced, his joy fleeting. The widow's lantern. The lantern had been her husband's prized possession. A sturdy, old-fashioned piece of iron and glass, it had hung by their front door for years, casting a warm glow over their modest farmhouse. After his death, Evelyn couldn't bear to part with it. She brought it inside, setting it on the mantel as a keepsake of the man she had loved. At first, the lantern seemed like a comforting presence, a flickering reminder of better days. But as the weeks turned into months, Evelyn began to notice something strange. The flame burned brighter than it should have, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. And sometimes, late at night, she thought she saw shapes moving within its glow, shapes that didn't belong to her or anything in the room. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the light. After all, grief did strange things to the mind. But one evening, as she sat knitting by the fire, the lantern's glow shifted. The light grew colder, sharper, and the shadows it cast began to take form. Evelyn froze, her knitting slipping from her hands. The shadow on the wall wasn't hers. It was a man's, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a familiar stance. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow turned toward her, and for a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw eyes glinting in the darkness. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The lantern flickered, and the shadow vanished. The next night, Evelyn found herself drawn to the lantern. She lit it as the sun set, watching as the flame leapt to life. This time, she wasn't imagining things. The light pulsed, casting shapes that danced across the room. Slowly, they began to solidify. Figures emerged from the shadows, ghostly and translucent. There were 3 of them: a young woman with hollow eyes, an older man with a gaping wound in his chest, and a boy no older than 10 clutching a broken toy. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding. "What? What do you want?" The young woman stepped forward, her gaze piercing. "Justice," she said, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "For what?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For what your husband did to us," the woman replied. The ghosts told their stories one by one, their voices heavy with sorrow. The young woman had been a maid in their household, dismissed under false accusations of theft, and later found dead in the woods. The older man had been a tenant farmer, evicted in the dead of winter when he couldn't pay his rent. The boy had been the son of a neighbor, who had vanished one stormy night after an argument with Evelyn's husband. Evelyn listened in stunned silence, the weight of their accusations pressing down on her. She had known her husband to be a stern and proud man, but she had never imagined him capable of such cruelty. "Why come to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because you carry his name," the older man said, "and because you hold the lantern." The lantern, they explained, was no ordinary light. It was a vessel, a conduit between the living and the dead. Her husband had used it to conceal his sins, its glow masking the spirits of those he had wronged. But with his death, the lantern's power had shifted, and the spirits were now free to seek justice. Evelyn felt a chill run through her. "What do you want me to do?" "Help us," the boy said, his voice small and pleading. "Or join him in the darkness," the young woman added, her tone sharp. Evelyn spent the next day in a daze, the ghost's words echoing in her mind. She wandered through the house, touching the objects her husband had left behind: a pipe, a pair of boots, a worn leather journal. Each one seemed heavier now, burdened with the weight of his secrets. As night fell, she lit the lantern once more. The ghosts appeared immediately, their forms sharper and more defined. "I don't know how to help you," Evelyn admitted, her voice breaking. The older man stepped forward. Confess his sins. Let the world know what he did. But he's gone, she said. What good will it do now? It will free us, the young woman said, and it will free you. Evelyn wrestled with her decision for days. She loved her husband, despite his flaws, and the thought of tarnishing his memory filled her with dread. But the ghost's presence grew stronger each night, their pain impossible to ignore. Finally, she made her choice. She took the lantern into town, where she stood before the church, and rang the bell to gather the townsfolk. When they arrived, she told them everything. The stories the ghosts had shared, the secrets her husband had kept hidden. Some scoffed, dismissing her as a grieving widow driven mad by loneliness. But others listened, their faces pale as they recalled their own encounters with her husband's wrath. That night, the lantern burned brighter than ever. The ghosts appeared one last time, their forms glowing with a soft, golden light. "Thank you," the young woman said, her voice filled with relief. The Crimson Carnival. The townsfolk of Meadowbrook awoke one crisp autumn morning to find the sprawling fields on the outskirts of town transformed. Overnight, vibrant tents of crimson and gold had sprouted like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Banners fluttered in the breeze, promising wonders beyond imagination and thrills to last a lifetime. No one had seen the carnival arrive. There had been no trucks, no workers setting up. It was simply there. By midday, the air buzzed with excitement. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, begging to go. Teenagers whispered about sneaking in after dark. Even the adults, skeptical at first, found themselves drawn to the strange allure of the carnival. At dusk, the gates opened. The entrance was a towering archway, crafted from intertwined metal that seemed to pulse like veins. A sign above it read, "The Crimson Carnival, where dreams and nightmares collide." Beneath it stood a man in a crimson coat and top hat, his face obscured by a porcelain mask painted with a permanent grin. He bowed deeply to each visitor, gesturing them inside with a flourish. "Welcome, one and all," he intoned, his voice smooth and inviting. "Step inside and let the wonders begin." The attractions were unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen. There was the Hall of Reflections, where mirrors didn't just show your image, but your deepest desires, or your darkest fears. Children squealed with delight as they saw themselves as superheroes or royalty, but some adults emerged pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. The Ferris wheel soared higher than seemed possible, its apex disappearing into the clouds. Riders returned dazed, speaking of sights they couldn't describe, their eyes shimmering with an unnatural glow. The centerpiece of the carnival was the Big Top, a massive tent that seemed to shift and ripple like liquid under the moonlight. Inside, performers defied logic and reason. Acrobats danced on invisible tightropes, fire eaters consumed flames that burned black, and a magician pulled living creatures, birds, snakes, even a deer, from his hat. But there was a cost. At first it was subtle. A man who spent too long in the Hall of Reflections woke the next morning to find his hair had turned stark white. A child who rode the Ferris wheel complained of strange dreams, her eyes now a shade too bright. Then, the disappearances began. It was Mrs. Lark who first noticed. Her son Tommy had gone to the carnival with his friends and never returned. When she confronted the masked man at the gate, he simply tilted his head. "All who enter the Crimson Carnival are free to leave," he said, "but not all choose to." Desperate, she pushed past him, charging into the carnival grounds. The attractions were still bustling, laughter and music filling the air. But as she wandered deeper, the atmosphere changed. The lights dimmed, the music warped, and the laughter took on a sinister edge. She found Tommy near the Big Top, staring blankly at the performers inside. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. When she grabbed his arm, he turned to her, but there was no recognition in his gaze. "Tommy?" she whispered. "I'm happy here, Mama," he said, his voice flat and distant. "Don't want to leave." Before she could respond, the masked man appeared beside her, his movements unnaturally smooth. "It's best not to disturb the performers," he said, his tone polite but firm. Mrs. Lark fled, leaving her son behind. As the days passed, more children vanished, and the townsfolk grew uneasy. Yet they couldn't resist the pull of the carnival. Even those who swore to stay away found themselves wandering through its gates, as if compelled by an unseen force. The mayor called a meeting, demanding answers. But when he led a group to confront the carnival workers, they found only the masked man waiting for them. "We are but humble entertainers," he said, bowing deeply. "Our guests are free to leave at any time." "But they don't!" the mayor shouted. "What are you doing to them?" The masked man's grin seemed to widen, though the porcelain mask didn't move. "The carnival gives what is asked for," he said, "and takes what is owed." The truth came to light on the final night. The Big Top announced its grand finale, promising a spectacle unlike any other. The entire town gathered, unable to resist the lure of the crimson tents. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The masked man stood at the center of the ring, his voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "Tonight we honor the pact," he declared. "Tonight the carnival claims what is owed." The lights dimmed and the performers emerged. But they were no longer human. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their faces grotesque masks of pain and ecstasy. They danced and writhed, drawing the crowd into a hypnotic trance. Elliot, a local farmer, tried to leave, but his feet refused to move. Beside him, his wife stared blankly ahead, tears streaming down her face. But the Phantom's Serenade. The violin arrived at her door on a rainy evening, wrapped in an old, tattered cloth. Eliza's heart leapt at the sight of it, a rare treasure from an estate auction she'd impulsively bid on. The auctioneer's description had been vague, but the allure of a handcrafted 18th century violin had been irresistible. It was exquisite. The body was carved from dark, aged wood that gleamed like polished obsidian. Intricate patterns of ivy and roses were etched along the edges, and the bow, though worn, still held strands of what looked like silver thread. Yet, as Eliza ran her fingers over the strings, a chill crept up her spine. The instrument felt unnaturally cold, as though it had been resting in a crypt. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to the damp weather. That night, she decided to play it. The first note was unlike anything she had ever heard. It resonated deep within her, a sound both mournful and enchanting. The melody seemed to spill from her fingers unbidden, a haunting tune she didn't recognize yet couldn't stop playing. As the music filled her small apartment, the air grew heavy. Shadows flickered along the walls, stretching and twisting in the candlelight. She felt as though she were no longer alone. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed was oppressive. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, but the room was empty. Shaking her head, she placed the violin back in its case and went to bed. That night she dreamed of an audience cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured. They sat in rapt attention as she played, their skeletal hands clapping soundlessly when she finished. The next day, Eliza couldn't shake the melody from her mind. It lingered, threading through her thoughts like a persistent whisper. She tried to practice her usual repertoire, but her fingers refused to cooperate. They stumbled through scales and faltered on familiar pieces. Frustrated, she reached for the cursed violin. The moment she began to play, the music flowed effortlessly. The haunting tune returned, more intricate and sorrowful than before. She lost herself in it, hours slipping by unnoticed. When she finally stopped, she realized the sun had set. Her apartment was bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. And then she saw them, faint outlines of figures standing just beyond the glass. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figures didn't move, didn't knock, didn't speak. They simply stood, watching. The days blurred into nights, and Eliza found herself consumed by the violin. She stopped answering calls, stopped leaving her apartment. The haunting melody became her sole obsession, each note a thread pulling her deeper into its web. The shadowy audience grew bolder. They no longer waited outside but appeared in the corners of her vision, flickering like candle flames. She would catch glimpses of them in mirrors, their hollow eyes fixed on her. One evening, as she played, the room grew icy cold. The shadows coalesced, forming the figure of a man draped in a tattered cloak. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes like black voids. "You play beautifully," he said, his voice a low rasp. Eliza's fingers faltered, the bow slipping from her grasp. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am the keeper of the melody," he replied. "And you are its vessel." "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "The violin binds you to the song," he said, stepping closer. "Each note feeds the audience, keeps them tethered to this world. But the melody demands a price." "What price?" He smiled, revealing teeth as sharp as knives. "Your soul." Eliza tried to rid herself of the violin. She locked it in its case, shoved it into the back of her closet, and even considered burning it. But no matter where she hid it, the melody haunted her. It echoed in her dreams, whispered through the walls, and hummed in her ears. One night, desperate for escape, she hurled the violin into the river. She watched as it sank beneath the dark water, the ripples fading into stillness. For a moment she felt relief. But as she turned to leave, the melody began to play. It rose from the depths of the river, louder and more insistent than ever. When she returned home, the violin was waiting for her, resting on her bed as if it had never left. The final performance came on a stormy night. Eliza awoke to find her apartment filled with the shadowy audience. They crowded the room, their forms flickering like dying embers. The man in the tattered cloak stood at the center, holding the violin. "It is time," he said, extending it to her. Tears streamed down her face as she took the instrument. Her hands trembled, but the moment her fingers touched the strings, the music took over. The melody was unlike anything she had played before, grand, sorrowful, and filled with a yearning that seemed to tear at her very soul. The House of Forgotten Faces. The house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its weathered exterior and ivy-covered walls giving it an air of forgotten grandeur. Thomas Reed had been searching for a fresh start after his divorce, and the house, with its affordable price and spacious interior, seemed like the perfect place to rebuild his life. The realtor had been vague about the house's history, brushing off his questions with a practiced smile. "It's an old house," she'd said, "and old houses have stories." Thomas, eager to move on from his own troubled past, didn't press further. On his first night, as he unpacked boxes in the dimly lit living room, he noticed the mirrors. There was one in nearly every room, their ornate frames tarnished with age. They seemed out of place, relics of a bygone era, yet they added a strange charm to the house. The first face appeared 3 days later. Thomas had just stepped out of the shower, wiping steam from the bathroom mirror. As he leaned closer to shave, he froze. There, just behind his reflection, was the faint outline of another face, a woman's. Her features were pale and blurred, as though she were standing behind frosted glass. He spun around, his heart racing, but the bathroom was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the face was gone. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, trying to shake off the unease. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the face. Over the following days, the faces became more frequent. They appeared in the mirrors at odd times. A man with hollow eyes staring at him as he brushed his teeth. A child's somber expression watching him from the hallway mirror. They never moved or spoke, but their presence was suffocating. Thomas tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or his mind playing games with him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The faces weren't just reflections. They were watching him. One evening, as he sat in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey, he decided to confront the mirrors. He stood before the largest one, its cracked frame casting shadows on the wall. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The mirror remained still, reflecting only his pale, anxious face. He turned to leave, but then he heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves. He turned back, and there they were. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass, their expressions a mix of sorrow and anger. They stared at him, their eyes pleading. Desperate for answers, Thomas began researching the house's history. He scoured old newspapers and town records, piecing together a chilling narrative. Over the past century, every family that had lived in the house had suffered tragedy, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and madness. The house had earned a grim reputation, and locals avoided it. One article mentioned a widow, Eleanor Hart, who had lived there in the 1920s. She was known for her obsession with mirrors, believing they could trap the souls of the dead. Thomas's blood ran cold. Were these faces the souls of those who had died in the house? And if so, what did they want from him? That night, the faces became more aggressive. They appeared in every mirror, their mouths moving soundlessly as they pressed against the glass. The whispers grew louder, filling the house with an eerie cacophony. Thomas tried to cover the mirrors, draping them with sheets and turning them to face the walls. But the faces found other ways to reach him. He saw them in the reflections of windows, in the surface of his coffee, even in the glossy screen of his phone. He couldn't escape them. The breaking point came when he awoke to find the largest mirror in his bedroom uncovered. He was certain he had draped it the night before. As he stared at it, paralyzed with fear, the faces began to emerge. This time they spoke. "You must join us," they whispered, their voices overlapping like a sinister choir. "No!" Thomas shouted, backing away. "I'm not like you." "You live here now," they said. "You belong to the house." Thomas fled, grabbing his car keys and racing out the door. But as he drove through the empty streets, he realized the faces weren't confined to the house. They appeared in the rearview mirror, in the reflections of street signs, even in the glint of his watch. Exhausted and terrified, Thomas returned to the house. He knew there was no escaping it. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others. He stood before the largest mirror, his reflection pale and gaunt. The faces stared back at him, their expressions unrelenting. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "To remember," they said. "To see what we saw, to feel what we felt." The mirror began to ripple, and Thomas felt himself being pulled toward it. He tried to resist, but the force was too strong. As he touched the glass, a wave of memories flooded his mind. Pain, betrayal, loss. The Clockmaker's apprentice. The shop was a relic from another era, nestled on a narrow cobblestone street that seemed forgotten by time. Its faded sign read, "Horace Delaney, Clockmaker," in ornate gold letters. The windows displayed a mesmerizing array of clocks, gilded grandfather clocks, delicate pocket watches, and intricate cuckoo clocks, each ticking in perfect harmony. For years, Ezra had worked as Horace Delaney's apprentice, learning the art of clockmaking under the old man's meticulous guidance. When Horace passed away suddenly, leaving the shop to Ezra, he felt both honored and overwhelmed. The shop had been his sanctuary, and now it was his responsibility. But as Ezra settled into his new role, he began to notice peculiarities in the shop, small, unsettling details that Horace had never mentioned. On his first night alone, Ezra was closing up when he heard a faint ticking sound that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't unusual to hear ticking in a clock shop, but this sound was different, faster, almost frantic. He followed it to the back room, where Horace had kept his most prized possessions. There, tucked away in a dusty cabinet, Ezra found a clock he had never seen before. It was unlike any other in the shop, its face adorned with strange, arcane symbols instead of numbers. The hands moved erratically, jerking forward and backward, as if struggling against some invisible force. As he reached out to touch it, a sharp jolt of cold shot through his hand, and he pulled back with a gasp. The ticking stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Over the following days, Ezra tried to focus on running the shop, but the strange clock haunted him. Customers came and went, marveling at the craftsmanship of the timepieces, but Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until Mrs. Abernathy, a longtime customer, returned to the shop that Ezra began to piece together the truth. She was a sprightly woman in her 60s, always cheerful and full of energy. But when she walked in that day, she looked frail, her movements sluggish. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Abernathy?" Ezra asked, concerned. She hesitated, her gaze drifting to a grandfather clock she had purchased weeks earlier. "It's strange," she said. "Ever since I brought that clock home, I've felt tired, like the days are slipping away faster than they should." Ezra promised to look into it, but her words planted a seed of dread in his mind. He began to examine the clocks more closely, searching for anything unusual. What he found left him cold. Each clock had a hidden compartment, accessible only by a mechanism so intricate it could only have been designed by Horace himself. Inside these compartments were small vials filled with a shimmering golden liquid. Ezra didn't know what it was, but he could feel its power, a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. Desperate for answers, Ezra delved into Horace's old journals, which were filled with cryptic notes and diagrams. One entry caught his eye. "Time is the most precious currency. To take it is a sin, but to waste it is worse. The clocks demand their due, and so I must obey." Ezra's stomach turned as the implications sank in. The clocks weren't just measuring time, they were stealing it. Every tick, every chime siphoned moments from the lives of their owners, storing them in the vials. He thought of Mrs. Abernathy, of the other customers who had come into the shop looking weary and aged. Horace had been stealing their time, feeding it to the clocks for reasons Ezra couldn't yet comprehend. That night, Ezra confronted the strange clock in the back room. He dismantled it carefully, his hands trembling as he worked. Inside, he found a vial larger than the others, its golden liquid swirling with an almost hypnotic energy. As he held it, the room seemed to shift around him. Shadows lengthened, and the ticking of the clocks grew louder, more insistent. He felt a presence, something vast and ancient watching him. "You've inherited my burden," a voice whispered, low and gravelly. Ezra spun around, but the room was empty. The voice continued, emanating from the shadows. The clocks must be fed. If they are not, they will take what they need from you. Ezra refused to accept it. He couldn't continue Horus's sinister work, no matter the cost. He resolved to destroy the clocks, to free the stolen time and end the cycle. But the clocks fought back. As he smashed the first one, a surge of energy knocked him to the ground. The golden liquid spilled from the broken vial, evaporating into the air. He felt a sudden crushing weight, as if years were being pulled from his own life. The other clocks began to chime in unison, their rhythms discordant and chaotic. The shop filled with a deafening cacophony, and Ezra realized he was running out of time. Literally.